Most executive directors are happy to do their work behind the scenes and have the artists, their artworks, and the audience receive most of the attention. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, said the Wizard of Oz. This is a major hallmark of our style. Today's conversation will attempt to pull the curtain back to give a glimpse of people heading a few craft institutions, how their positions function, and what makes them tick as professionals. My colleagues in this conversation are Fabio Fernández. He's the executive director of the Society of Arts and Crafts in Boston. Prior to that, he was an associate curator at the Cranbrook Art Museum and received his MFA from the Cranbrook Academy of Art. Fernández has shaped national exhibitions, including the Theater of Repetition, Slipcast Ceramics, Pop Craft, and Wendy Murayama, Executive Order 9066. He is a Haystack Mountain School of Crafts trustee. My second colleague on the stage here with me is Jean McLaughlin, who has served as the executive director of the Penland School of Crafts for 18 years. She has created new and improved studio facilities for teaching numerous mediums and established the school on the National Register of Historic Places. She has served on the boards of SURF and the Center for Craft, Creativity, and Design, and she is currently on the boards of the North Carolina Arts Council, and she's just joined the Board of Trustees of the American Craft Council. Please welcome them. We're running, as everyone else has been doing, we're running images that we've each selected to represent our institutions. They should be self-explanatory. I started this process by sending each of them something like 17 questions, and we've narrowed it down to 5. So we're going to try and keep this to about 5 minutes a question, but we have plenty to discuss at the discussion tables afterwards this afternoon. First question. People on the outside tend to think executive directors have a great deal of control over their organizations when we really are responsible to many people. We exercise power, but also lack total control. Can you talk a little about how we don't call all the shots as people might think? How much influence does any executive director have over how his or her institution carries out its mission? Talk among yourselves.
I think Jean should start.
Well, I was focusing first on the notion of power and control in your question, and I thought that, first of all, I just don't use those words, and I don't think of it that way, which is probably why you were setting it up, maybe, that way. I think of this as very much being about shared power, shared responsibility, not power. So that we help to create a vision. We know that we are ultimately responsible, and yet nothing's going to happen if everybody else isn't on board. So I think about the two ends of or maybe it's more than two, but the notion of there being a board of directors that we are responsible to, that are ultimately overseeing the organization, and it's our role to be stewarding them and guiding them and helping to lay out and lead a vision process with them. And then there's the staff, and the staff is not going to be motivated if they're just doing what we might be thinking. And at Penland, we have 65 staff members, and so that means that more than anything, I have to get out of their way. And I wouldn't say that I always do that, but I really believe that the real leadership role and the kind of notion of how we get our work done is by helping to empower other people to do their work well. So the piece that I think I work the very most on is how to determine which of our board members have which skills, and then how to pull them into assisting and advising and guiding and stewarding, doing their roles well when I know what their skill set is. and then helping the staff feel empowered to do the, people in our field really like to do a good job, and they're so skilled and so bright and so passionate about the work that helping them to be able to realize their dreams through our institutions, I think, is part of how I would answer that question.
Yeah, first of all, let me say that I'm happy and lucky to be in a leadership position because of, the former director, Beth Ann Gerstein, left me with a organization that was financially sound and poised for the next chapter. So, I want to acknowledge the previous leadership. I think that the trustees and the staff for me are the biggest challenges, and I was listening even to Chris Odmundson's remarks this morning. I'm always curious as to who executive directors thank first. Is it their staff or is it the trustees? And it's a really tough one because, like Miguel said yesterday or this morning, the trustees of the ACC are volunteers. But it's not just that they're volunteers, they actually pay to help, right? So I have to weigh that when I'm thanking either staff or trustees first. But yeah, I agree that there's huge challenges, and it's a shared responsibility and leadership, and it's a matter of keeping my staff engaged and developed and growing, and then also tapping the time, talent, and treasure of our trustees. And it's a lot more difficult than I ever thought it would be.
I wrote down ringmaster, cheerleader, public face for the institution, and I also wrote down we set the tone, we deal with the aesthetics tone. We're also there to ensure that ethics and transparency are part of the institution. And then I also made a note about publics, underlining the S, and audiences, underlining the S, because it is so much more than just the public and the audience. We have many more audiences. I mean, in my institution, I'm responsible to the poorest child in the inner city, to the richest person in the community, and everybody in between, because they make up our audiences.
I was thinking, too, about the relationship between strategic planning and knowing your institution's mission, and then that brings in stakeholders, and then all those S's, and just you can say their audiences, their communities, plural. It's so true. We serve so many different types of communities, and we have to be thinking about those stakeholders all the time, because our staff and our board and our public school audiences, our students, our visitors, our donors, they're all a part of our responsibility to nurture.
Everybody has an opportunity to learn, and I think that's one of the things we're supposed to be facilitating.
Yeah. The artists is, of course, I mentioned trustees and staff, but implied with that, the other key stakeholder for us are artists. And so we make sure that we have artists on our board of trustees and artists on staff. And I think in terms of institutional leadership, sometimes it's so important to just kind of turn the reins over to artists, or I should say turn the controlled reins over to artists. I'm thinking about Wendy Maruyama in particular. Like, Wendy Maruyama has an idea and she's gonna make it happen, and she's gonna drag any student, professor, friend, poodle, cat, and she's gonna will it to happen. So sometimes it's a matter of like getting out of the way and supporting that person. There's Wendy Maruyama right there, everybody.
And just to piggyback a little bit on the previous session, if you're looking at the museum structure at least, and there's a parallel in the educational portion of the field as well. Most curators focus on a period, some specific type of work. I mean, there's a parameter established, a set of parameters established so that they can focus in and kind of drill down. When you get to the directorship level, you have to keep stepping back, because it's so much of our job is about the big picture for the institution, and we're not just responsible for the objects. We're responsible for the facility, the property, the livelihood of the staff, the people we employ. And I say it's sort of like parallel parking the Exxon Valdez and trying not to let too much of the oil leak out at the same time. Let's go on to another question. What do you think about the present state of institutional leadership in the field? Curatorial, editorial, organizational. What do we do well? What could be improved? What kinds of backgrounds and skill sets do you think we need to find in our incoming professional leaders?
I feel funny speaking first because I've only led an organization for 2 years, and Jean has done tremendous things in 18 years. But I think that we do a lot of things well. I think that we have fun and that we celebrate really well. I think that we build communities really well. Sometimes one of the things that we need to do better is there are these very strong pockets of communities within our field, right? So the NCECA conference is this mammoth, successful undertaking. Then there's the Glass Art Society, the Furniture Society, the SNAG conference. You know, a part of me thinks that that kind of dilutes the energy of the field as a whole. So that's something that I think we could do better. I think that what we do really well is we burn through the talent of executive directors and trustees really well. So I'd like to move towards some sort of a model where there's a sabbatical, right? University faculty, every 7 years you have a sabbatical, right? Stuart Kestenbaum had to wait 25 years to get a sabbatical. That's just not sustainable or logical. And I think it's up to the director, the executive directors, and the trustees to speak up to that. I think that we do potlucks really well, and I think that sometimes a potluck is the right thing to do. Sometimes to have glassware and a catered event is the right thing to do. I think that we do seconds sales really well, and I think that's a horrible thing. You know, what other person says, here's something that I made that is slightly defective or off, take it out into the world to represent who I am. So I gave you some pros and probably more cons than I should have, but I'm trying to be frank.
Yeah, I don't know that I struggled with this question because I kept thinking about whether, like, what is our field, you know? And so maybe I feel like I came to our field or I'm an outsider or an interloper into this field, even though I've been doing this for 18 years. You would think I wouldn't say that. But I come from a place of wanting craft to be seen in a much larger interdisciplinary world. So I think of craft not as a part of a conversation around whether craft is art, which I think we've moved past. But I come more from a place of thinking about where is craft as a field in relation to our field of anthropology or sociology or political science or global interrelations. And so I want to see our field, I would love to imagine our field as being bigger than it is, and I don't really know how to do this, but I think about this as being that craft is a part of so much more about life and the world and everyday experience and intellectual experience. I mean, it's like it's got the potential to be so much bigger than just a field of craft. I mean, whatever that is, and I don't know what that is. But so that's one way of saying that. I think that craft is an area, from my experience, that seems incredibly generous, and that artists are at the core and the strength of our field. And then everyone else that's a part of our field is a part of it because of the artist. So the artists are the center, and out from that become the people that collect that work or that support that work, or they see our educational institution influencing people, so they want to support the work of the institutions. So it's like how community grows and evolves because artists are at the center. And maybe you could say it's what is it that drew the artists to that center. So then it might be the hand and making and the power of communicating in a way that's not verbal, that there is, this I like to think about us having a language that's from the net down, so that we really understand, maybe we're closer to dance than we are to something else. So I think that the craft field is, I don't know, it's like, has the opportunity to be much more than we even are now, and yet we are really broadening from where we were 20 years ago. So that's a bit of a ramble. I think about the fact that we're non-elitist. And from where I came from prior to coming to Penland, where I've been involved in arts systems, policy thinking from the 70s forward. So we've really gone through this phase of elitism and separatism and a kind of closed, a more closed kind of an art world, to being a much more open one. Not that we've gotten where we need to be, but I've seen a real shift occurring, in that regard. I think of us as open-minded. I think some institutions are more nimble than others, and so I like the fact that say a place like Penland or Haystack or Aramont or Peters Valley, that we can all be a little more nimble than maybe some academic institutions. What do we need? I think part of what we need is we need to have the world of philanthropy being more supportive of what we do. I feel like I've been trying for several decades now to crack into certain worlds of funding that still don't
exist.
exist.
Or are hiding.
They don't see that. They just don't. They're not being as supportive of this incredible field that is hard to define, which could go parallel with why they're not supporting us. I think there could be a really richer, deeper connection to interdisciplinary thinking and learning. And so I've been out there thinking about how there's been a growing field in the academic world. The notion of having, lifelong learning and parts of colleges and universities that are dealing with continuing education, we, at least at Penland in my world, we intersect with that kind of learning. But I'm thinking right now about the Masters of Liberal Studies programs that exist and have really been growing in the last 20 years. That might be a nice interface for the craft world that I'm envisioning, to be finding some partners and allies where there's deeper kind of thinking along that interdisciplinary role. I think we have strong networks, and that's one of our strengths and beauties, that we can, celebrate that and strengthen that. I do think that we're pretty fearless, and we ought to be really proud of that as a part of our field. I think I said sharing, because I think that we are really open around giving the generosity of spirit, that we give our information out freely. There's not this kind of territoriality or protectionism.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't say fearless, but I think that sometimes we are like supplicants, and we shouldn't be supplicants. We're applicants. I'm thinking in particularly with civic government. You talked about potential philanthropies and sources of funding. I think that corporations and the towns that all our organizations are in, or where we live, really need to step up more. So, you know, having gone through the build out of this space, I realized that we didn't really have enough support in our existing trustee and stakeholder and foundation support system, so it really was up to the city of Boston to step in. So I started talking about, you know, hey, what we do is we advocate for the weaver to be in their studio creating their work, and they're like, what? And then I put in financial terms. Okay, we are going to employ X amount of people, and they're going to sell X amount of product, bringing in X amount of tourists to Boston. I just think we have to be a little more assertive in making our case to those people, you know.
And it's frequently the executive director that makes those kinds of pitches to people and kind of sums up the institution's strengths in whatever system the recipient of the pitch can best be reached.
Right.
You try to source that out before you go. One of the things I wrote down was I'm concerned about where the new directors for U.S. craft museums will come from. It's never been a very large pool, but when you think about the traditional method in art museums being you work your way up through curatorial positions and then into the directorships, we have fewer craft-focused museums now than we did 10 years ago. We have curators who seem to be just really fine and happy with staying in the curatorial position because they don't want to deal with all the stuff that executive directors have to deal with. They're walking away from that, or they're going out of the curatorial positions in museums and going to working for other organizations. I don't necessarily have any suggestions yet on what can be done, but I wondered if either of you, I mean, I don't think it's the same thing in the craft education institutions because there's so many avenues for teaching and workshops and universities and colleges with departments, and there's a lot of flux, of course, but there's still a lot of activity there. The museums seem to be a little bit more of a closed set right now to me, and it seems to be funneling down rather than expanding.
Yeah. Well, I know that Chris Odmundson, for instance, came from a field outside of contemporary craft, and he's done a really good job. So I think that, you know, we could seek leaders in non-related fields. You know, a part of us always cringes. We're like, oh, he doesn't know materials or artists. But I think that the right person can quickly get up to speed and learn those things. In terms of the next generation, I'm a little bit biased, but I think that what curators do in terms of dealing with objects and ideas and budgets and the development aspects of what curators do translates really well to the job of director. By show of hands, is there anyone in here who would want to be an executive director of an arts organization in this field? Don't be shy. Okay.
I see two. That's not three. That's
Okay.
not boding very well for the
stand up
future.
instead. Can you
Yeah.
stand up? That'll be, because we
Yeah.
can't see very well. Come on. Don't be
saw
shy. You were
10.
raising your hand.
Yeah. Oh, that's better now. Okay,
Yeah.
All right.
great.
Maybe 30 people.
I mean, but I will flip that coin for
Yeah.
just a minute before we go on to the next question, and that is that I think, at least for the past 20 years, most of the people that came into executive positions at museums were former curators, and they suddenly got into this position and realized, OMG, there's no time to look at the objects, you know, or it was more like WTF, there's no time to look at the objects, and that removal to such a heavily administrative position within the institution can be, I think, frustrating at times because you're so close to the candy in the window, but there's a pane of glass between you and the candy now suddenly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, think about that. Talk among yourselves. Okay, next. See, I decided if this was going to get really boring, I told them I was bringing a flask of vodka, which is the museum director's drink of choice because they can't find it on your breath. And we were going to turn this into a drinking game, and whenever we said the magic words, board of directors or mission statement, we were each going to have to drink from, and it was going to loosen us up, and we would have had 2 drinks already on Jean, but the goal was also to have the 3 of us still employed when we walked off the stage, so I left the flask at home. But we're now going to move from institutional viewpoints to personal questions, you and your job. What about your job responsibilities is as you expected when you started your job, and what's different? I had this under a category called Marry in Haste, Repent in Leisure. Also, what's the single biggest challenge in your work? In other words, what is your worst day like? What is your best day like?
So I'll start.
Go ahead.
And this is kind of a segue from your point about going from being a curator to being the executive director. I was like a program officer for the North Carolina Arts Council. So I was on the giving money away side of things. And I had been educated as an artist. I still thought of myself as an artist. I still made art a little bit until I got to Penland. So when I went to Penland, I thought I was going to go just jump right into that candy box, you know. And so what was a surprise to me was, I mean, how many of y'all have been to Penland? This is like, do I want to actually say these things? I've been thinking about whether I'm going to actually say what I could say or not say what I could say. But anyway, during my interview for my job, they asked me this one question, and they said, what do you think is going to be the hardest thing for you at Penland? And I said, well, I'm arachnophobic. And I just, you know, I thought I just am not quite sure how I'm going to deal with this. And so at the time, I mean, that probably was some reflection of naivete in what was going to be ahead of me. But all I could picture was my various site visits to Penland over those years and how many spiders there were in all of the housing. And you know, it wasn't, I hadn't even gotten to how am I going to, like, walk around in the woods. But, you know, and, you know, I can still hear people in the hallway in the offices screaming when there are 2 or 3 others that are arachnophobic on the staff. And so, you know, you'll hear a scream and then you'll know that some gigantic spider has just walked across the hall. Anyway, you're going to have to help reel me back in.
No,
if
that's
I
all
get
right.
too far away.
Yeah.
So,
And I was worried about the flask.
So I thought, oh, I'm going to get to be Bill Brown. I'm going to get to go hang out in the studios and talk art and, you know, eat fabulous food, and I'll set my loom up in the weaving studio, and at night I will go weave. And
Oh, yeah.
that happened for about a week.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it turns out that, you know, I began to learn everything from the ground up. And I had been quite involved in strategic planning, campus master planning. I'd run a public art program, so I knew a lot about the interface between artists and architects and place. And it just so happened that that's really what we needed to do. So I got to remove a lot of spiders from a lot of housing. And, you know, not literally, spiders are fine. But I moved into a campus renovation initiative, and I really think of what I've always done with my career was to help artists make art, you know, to facilitate that process so that artists could be making their work, or that people could be living a creative life. It doesn't have to be artists in this particular, the Penland case. But I found that I was learning about how to how to create a nest for that creative process to occur in long into the future. So building building infrastructure, both board, strategic planning, ding ding, and the physical plant. You know, we were building all of that. We were creating a really robust organization that functioned really well on a lot of different levels. And so that was not what I came in there thinking I was going to do, but it became apparent very quickly. Did that answer your question?
I think in a roundabout, yeah.
So the job responsibilities as I expected them, I mean, I knew I would lead the organization through this next chapter. I just didn't know that there were going to be so many challenges right away. Our landlord sold our building a couple months into my starting, and then we had 1/3 of our staff move to London for personal reasons. and then our Wi-Fi wasn't working, and our POS system was out of date, and you know, it all hit really hard. So that was the difference between what I thought and what the reality was. You asked what my worst day is like and what my best day is like. My worst day involves the finance committee. And you know, kind of the reckoning for here's how we're doing year to date. And first of all, understanding and absorbing what that means for myself, and then explaining that and adapting and making changes. Our finance committee include people that are like former treasurers of Citizens Bank and that sort of thing. And my best day is like, you know, Kimberly Winkle, who's here in the audience, getting a $25,000 John D. Minnick Fellowship, and she telling me and our staff and our trustees how important that has been, that investment in her career has been.
I always think about the head of Macy's, who was famously quoted as saying he always goes down to see what's going on the cosmetics floor because he wants to see what's happening on the first floor of the store, and that's where he thinks all the action is. And I love to go down in the building and watch people consuming the product. And first off, it gives you great insight on a personal one-to-one level with what's happening, and it is very much like the Midwesterner running a general store, you know, and I go down on my apron and talk to Mr. Haney, you know. But what's fun about it is those good days are when somebody comes up to you and says, you can see that they've just really connected with what you've shown, and it makes this kind of esoteric business of taking care of all these wonderful objects, but they're not living things, they're objects, but you see how that connection is important.
Bruce, can I just ask, Jean, you know, you mentioned that you were an artist by training and you thought that you would go to Penland and have a loom, and how has your studio practice and being director panned out? And do you know what I mean? Do you get to make work, or do you resent that you don't make work, or do you make time? I'm thinking sabbatical, but what were you like?
I think, well, two things. I draw on vacation. So that's like, so 2 weeks out of the year, I make a little art, but I wouldn't call it art. I just find it a way of observing and marking time. So at some point, I think during my first 10 to 15 years of working in an arts management field, I felt a really strong need for a sabbatical. I have not felt one since I've been at Penland. So that may say something about, even though I work quite hard, there's something quite rewarding about it that is feeding me in a way that I have not felt the need for a sabbatical. Now, I also know that I made a commitment to myself that I would hopefully live long enough to be able to make art at some point. So I will have a second career or a third career, whatever we want to call it, soon, where I will start to make art again. So, you know, I don't know that I'm a good example. I have not found a way to balance it in the way that some people who are makers do. Yeah, so you were asking me that, but I wanted to answer your best day and worst day.
Yeah.
If you
Go ahead.
You want me to?
Yeah.
We have an opportunity of what do you call it? It's like a benefit for staff to take classes. And this summer, one of our housekeepers took a class, and this woman had the biggest smile on her face every single day for 2 weeks. I mean, that has got to be one of the absolute best days of my life. Now, another good day, that picture that just went by, we have this beautiful pasture, and I asked the guys who mow the lawn to do a line drawing out in the pasture. And the first one was kind of, anyway, and I said, you know, loosen up a little bit. You'll come up with a better way to do it. I want a line drawing out in the pasture. And so I didn't know this, but the head of Facilities and Grounds gave a six-pack to the guy who was mowing the lawn, and then we ended up with that line drawing.
That could have also been your worst day if he'd gotten looped and fallen off the tractor.
Well, that's true. But that was like a good day. Every single day I have noticed, I mean, and this is not just me being a Pollyanna, every single day is different. And so every day can have a high moment and a low moment. And I think that most of my lowest moments were in the early years. But there are things that happen that you just would be the darndest things, where someone came on campus with a gun. And I'm thinking now, I realize that a lot of people in the world own guns, but I am not one of them, and I don't want a gun on our campus. So then how do I deal with not only this gun that's on campus, but the whole policy around guns on campus? So, you know, you might not think that you've got that kind of thing to deal with, or you've got a neighbor whose son has just gotten an RTV or whatever you call those things, and he's like riding all over campus making a lot of noise. And so, you know, it's like dealing with neighbors or, you know, so there.
It's all the external things I find. The things that really are problematic that give you bad days are things you can't necessarily control. I've got 2 more questions. We've got about 5 minutes, so we're going to do the rapid answer round, okay? Did you have a mentor? How did that work out for you? And are you mentoring anyone right now?
I had a mentor, Mary Regan, who was the executive director of the Arts Council, and I worked for her for 17 years. She was remarkable. I also had Jim Hackney, who is here, as a mentor in fundraising, and everything I learned about fundraising I got from Jim. And I want to be a mentor, and I've offered that. And I feel like I've mentored just a few people on our staff, but I wouldn't say that I'm being a mentor that I know of.
I have a mentor that helped me actually prepare for the executive director position and interview process. Her name is Beth Mora. She's the former chief financial officer at Harvard. So I tried to fill in some of my weak spots by finding mentors that could do that. And I am mentoring. I wouldn't say that I'm mentoring anyone right now. I'm writing a lot of reference letters, which is not the same. And I think I'm open to that, but I think it's a two-way street. Like, you know, they have to deepen the relationship as well, you know.
I've had a ton of mentors, not long-term. We come and go. Collectors and donors whom I've learned things from, board members whom I've learned things from, older colleagues in the field whom I've learned things from. Sometimes they knew they were mentoring me, sometimes they didn't. So paying back into the system, I'm sort of actively mentoring somebody who knows it now and actively mentoring someone who doesn't know it now. And trying to mentor a whole lot of other people by example, by leading by example, and taking consolation in that. Okay, and our last question. If experience were not an issue and you had a magic wand, what job in our field would you like to have instead of your own?
I would like a job that would enable me to be an artist one day, and a teacher one day, and a curator one day, and a writer one day, and maybe sleep for a day.
Like that?
Wow. I think the 4-day work week is a theme. I think I'd like to be Karen Carnes. You know, just up in the northern kingdom of Vermont and just making your work and doing outreach and helping others through various efforts, but just the solace and contemplation of your own quiet studio practice.
When I was a kid in Chicago, I wanted to run the Walker because I just thought it was such a cool place, the Walker Arts Center. And I really like where I am. It's the ideal place for me, and it has been for the last 40-some years. However, there are days when I'd like to jack it up and move it to a big city once in a while. Not that I don't love my local audience, but when I think about doing what we're doing in Manhattan or in San Francisco or somewhere where we'd have 300,000 visitors instead of 65,000 visitors, and I would have close access to, say, maybe a reviewer from the New York Times who might come over because we were in the neighborhood, and that we would reach more people that way. But, you know, there's trade-offs.
Yeah.
I think we're done.
Thank you.
Thank you.